Today we're going to read a little extract from Philip Roth, one of my favorite American novelists. The book in question is Patrimony. He calls it a true story. It's a kind of factual, although in some respects fictionalized also, I suppose you could say, account of the death of his father. Why are we looking at Philip Roth? We're looking at Philip Roth because we're continuing with our description of Freud's dream theory. We have so far covered the question of whose wish, why are dreams necessarily motivated by a wish for Freud? We've thought about latent and manifest content. We've thought about the distinction between latent and manifest content and the operation of the dream work, which is at the basis of the operation of dreaming for Freud. And what we've been building to, as you can see from the title here, is what are the four fundamental ideas that we need to grasp. And what we're really going to focus on is making these four fundamental ideas, which, as I've repeated many times, are the basic operations that make that explain how dreams are a form of thinking, how the unconscious processes things. If we're able to grasp those four ideas, to translate them into examples and ideas that we understand, then we will have understood something quite crucial about psychoanalysis and indeed about unconscious thinking and indeed about human psychology. So this is a dream that Philip Roth includes in his largely factual account of the death of his father. And the dream comes at the end of Patrimony, which is this whole long, it's not that long actually, but it's an account of the last days of his father's life and the eventual death of his father. So here we go. Philip Roth says, "I dreamed I was standing on a pier in a shadowy group of unescorted children who may or may not have been waiting to be evacuated. The pier was down in Port Newark, but the Port Newark of some 50 years ago, where I'd been taken by my father and my Uncle Ed to see the ships anchored in the bay that opened in the distance to the Statue of Liberty." He continues, "To be taken down to the harbour and onto the wharves to look up to the ships and out beyond the bay was to be put in touch momentarily with the geographical vastness that you couldn't imagine." He skips I'll skip a few lines, and then he says, "In the dream, a boat, a medium-sized, heavily armoured, battle-grey boat, some sort of old American warship, stripped of its armaments and wholly disabled, floated imperceptibly towards the shore. I was expecting my father to be on the ship, somehow to be among the crew, but there was no life on board and no sign anywhere of anyone in command. The dead silent picture, a portrait of the aftermath of a disaster, was frightening and eerie. A ghostly hulk of a ship, cleared by some catastrophe of all living things." Skip a few more lines. "Ultimately, the dream became unbearable and I woke up, despondent and frightened, whereupon I understood that it wasn't that my father was aboard the ship, but that my father was the ship. And to be evacuated was physiologically just that, to be expelled, to be ejected, to be born." In his conclusion, he says, "I lay in bed till it was light, thinking of all the family history compressed into that snippet of silent dream film. Just about every major theme of his life was encapsulated there. Everything of significance to both of us, starting from his immigrants' parents' transatlantic crossing to the end. The ending with his transformation by a brain tumor into an enfeebled wreck." Thank you, Philip Roth. Now, of course, the reason I've given you that extract is because I think it'll help us be able to illustrate these key concepts that we're trying to understand. So what we're going to do is just highlight and find another way, hopefully give an example and another way of describing each of these so that they can become usable to you, practicable, so you can use them, understand them in how you think about Freudian and indeed Lacanian psychoanalysis. So we've already said that condensation happens in dreams because there's a need to compress material. Interestingly, Philip Roth even uses that, I think. He says, "I lay in bed till it was light, thinking of all the family history compressed into that snippet of silent dream film." And you could say that in that respect, that's in part the beauty of dreams. Dreams can compress an awful lot of experiences into a small space. So that's what we've said condensation is. I've tried to give some other words here that help me understand condensation. You could say that's like a superimposition. Freud, I think, even uses at some point the example of when you have two pictures being developed that overlap two negatives, so you can kind of see them both on top of one another. I've used compression here. I've even used the kind of more everyday term of a mashup, whereby you have two songs mashed up into one another, two things being superimposed, being overlapped. And by the time we get to structural linguistics and people who come after Freud, they're saying, well, Freud calls it condensation. And if you want to keep it as condensation, that's great. That seems to me to be maybe an easier way to understand it. But people like Roman Jakobson, the linguist, says, actually, isn't it fascinating? Freud maybe doesn't realize he's doing it, but in this operation of superimposition, this compression, this condensation, this overlapping, what we essentially have is the operation of a metaphor. Because if Derek says he walks out and he's in the inky well and he's trying to describe night, that sentence works, the metaphor works, and the notion of night isn't completely obliterated, right? You have a metaphor which is a reference to a completely different frame of reference to poetically emphasize a certain meaning. But night and inky well, as it were, still remain there. So you could say that a metaphor is itself a kind of condensation. So that's your first kind of primary process operation of the unconscious. If you're a clinician, you need that concept to be able to get a sense of how in speech and in dreams you've had that compression. And for Freud, remember, that compression, that condensation happens in order to disguise some kind of. It's a disguise of sorts, it's a substitution of sorts. Let me give an example. Famous dream, Freud says, he dreams of a man with an orange beard. He dreams of a man with an orange beard. At the beginning of the dream, if I'm getting this right, it's clear that he's confronting this guy with an orange beard in his place of work. The guy's a nincompoop, he's an idiot, he's very irritating. Freud doesn't like him. And when he speaks again about the dream, it becomes clear that in the course of the dream, there's a man with an orange beard, which is his uncle, who also somehow in the dream becomes this other guy. What are we supposed to say about that? Well, says Freud, when you have that operation of condensation, it's a way of disguising a thought that maybe you don't want to confront. And you could say, well, what is the dream doing by making that compression, that condensation? Freud says, essentially what your unconscious is doing there, what the dream work is doing, is it's making an equation. Maybe I think this guy is an idiot, and he's very similar to my uncle, therefore, and Freud says, I never would have thought that. But it seems that some part of me thinks my uncle is a complete idiot, right? So this is how you could say that the operation of condensation is operating as a disguise. There's a thought there that Freud doesn't know he has, or if he has had it, he's tried to separate it from himself. No, I would never think about my uncle as an idiot. But the dream is presenting him with an implicit equation. One more idea about condensation is condensation happens with images. And remember, I've said that I think it's a universal feature of dreams that dreams do that. One place is simultaneously more than one place. One person is simultaneously more than one person, so on and so forth. But it also happens in language. So Freud has an example. He speaks about someone who is very keen to ingratiate himself to someone who's got a lot of money, to someone who's a millionaire. And in his speech, he goes, oh, that rich guy, he treated me most familiarly. In other words, he brings familiarly and millionaire together to make familiar. Sorry, I'm not obviously doing it very well. But that kind of compression of two words into one is, you could say, doing a kind of equation. It's doing a kind of wishfulness that the millionaire will treat him very familiarly. I got a kind of embarrassing one of my own. My wife's name is Marin, and I work with Marilyn. It's really embarrassing. Marilyn is the office manager where I work in my university, and she's awesome. She's like very, very efficient. Anyway, so I obviously I'm trying to not make any Freudian slips here. I also like Marilyn a lot. And the other day I'm at home and I say, oh, Marilyn. And Marilyn says, my name's Marin, not who's this Marilyn? And of course you could say that what was happening was there was a condensation of Marilyn. Oh, embarrassing. Nevertheless, condensation, both a mechanism of disguise and also a way in which your unconscious is bringing two things together, making an implicit equation. there's a way to interpret and think about what is happening there. I've also stressed that that's a form of metaphor. Now, keeping an eye on time, let's quickly move to symbolism. Symbolism is crucial, and of course, if anyone knows even just a small amount about Freudian theory, we have this idea of phallic symbols, symbols here, symbols there, symbols everywhere. Now, in all honesty, Freud does have sections of interpretation of dreams where he seems to also go to town with like, okay, the snake is a phallic symbol, the tree is this, and he seems at times to want to suggest that you could have symbols within dreams, right? That's why he makes reference to symbolism. But Freud is also a sophisticated thinker, and we need to interrogate the notion that dreams rely on symbols. Why? Well, if dreams are a kind of unconscious processing, if they are a way of conveying the thoughts that you precisely repress, the thoughts that are unpalatable to you, the thoughts that you want to keep hidden, that you don't want to confront, if dreams are the kind of pressure release valve which allows those unconscious thoughts to come, the latent thoughts to be expressed, then presumably they're going to need to be disguised. And if they need to be disguised, then symbols aren't the way to go. Why? Because if I have some desire, some wish that is trying to be spoken, that I'm trying to repress, if I simply have a symbolic representative of the thing that I want, that means it's very easily decoded. That means the dream is not disguised. So in a way, you could say that's almost an inaccuracy to think about dream symbols. Maybe more in Jungian psychoanalysis and other forms of psychoanalysis where you can have a kind of archetype or universal symbol, it works. But for Freud, I would argue, and certainly for Lacanian psychoanalysis to offer, it's not really symbols in dreams. Because otherwise you can imagine, well, I have a dream of a dove, and that means love or peace, and then I have a dream of a tree, which is the tree of life. I mean, maybe if you want to go a more Jungian way, you could do that. But it seems to me, and I think Freud is sophisticated enough to make this point, and he does, he says the symbolism in dreams is a very particular type of symbolism. It's not simply the universal symbols of a dove for peace, because if it were, then the dream wouldn't be disguised, and the dream needs to be disguised. So there is a kind of symbolism in dreams, but you could say it's a highly eccentric or idiosyncratic symbolism. It's a symbolism that would only make sense to, for example, Philip Roth. So Philip Roth says, I was taken down to the Port Newark. So listen to this sentence. The pier was down in Port Newark, but the Port Newark of some 50 years ago, where I had been taken by my father and Uncle Ed. So Philip Roth dreams of Port Newark. What does Port Newark stand for? Well, okay, it's Port Newark. But presumably it has that association. In a way, you could say that it starts to symbolize, it takes on the value of Uncle Ed and his father. So the point I'm trying to make, there's constant substitutions in dreams. We'll have a dream of being in a wonderful garden. Maybe, if we're taking seriously the notion of condensation, it'll remind me of 2 or 3 different other gardens or places. But you could also say that in the course of the dream, I'm in the garden, there's this wonderful flower, this wonderful tree, this wonderful magnolia tree. Sorry, working just off the top of my head here. You wouldn't want to, if you're doing a Freudian analysis, go, oh, tree of life, or magnolia. Let's get our dream book out and see magnolia. Oh, magnolia means this. That's not the case, because maybe for me, I had a terrible experience under a magnolia tree. Or maybe, for that matter, I had my first kiss. So if I dream of a magnolia tree, it is significant. It is a symbolization of something, but not a conventional universal symbol. It's what it might symbolize for me, for the dreamer. In other words, we should expect that there would be multiple substitutions, one thing standing for another. One tree means refers to something else. And these would not be conventional symbols, because otherwise there would be no disguise. So it's a highly eccentric form of symbolization, which is precisely why Freud says you need to free associate to the dream. Derek tells you about his magnolia garden dream. You don't just accept it, and you don't just go, oh, okay, the dove means this, the tree means this, because otherwise dreams would be easily decoded. You would have like a kind of universal dream code book. these things do exist. But for Freud, your unconscious is more creative than that. It's more fluent at finding different substitutions that won't so easily be spotted. So let's start to round up. The following lecture will go back to Philip Roth's Dream, and we'll try to find examples for each of these operations so that we can ground those operations and give them strong examples. But what we did today was we focused on condensation and symbolism. And the take-home point here would be, if you are, as it were, listening for the unconscious or trying to grasp something of the prospective unconscious value, signification of your dreams or your own utterances, one should listen out for and be aware of how a given statement or a given speech act or a dream might use forms of compression, which are making implicit equations, overlapping juxtapositions. What are those overlaps? What are those mashups doing? Why are they in place? They're not just arbitrary, says Freud. They mean something, which immediately gives you one tip for how you might think about an interpretation. If there is a condensation that I can see in speech, familiarly, or in a dream, why is that condensation? What are the implications of it? What is being told to us by those things being overlapped? Gratification is another one, by the way. I don't know, I was talking to a friend years ago, and we were having a final time, and I said, wow, man, let's go get some gratification. It's like, dude, that's not a word. But anyways, it's a condensation. You can interpret that as every way you want. The second one is the symbolism. And the easier way, I think, to think about symbolism is, how might it be that what I'm speaking of is a substitution for something else? Or what I'm dreaming of is a substitution. What are the replacements for that are, what else am I talking about when I talk about a sick dog, for example? Last little moment, and then we'll do our conclusion. Grey's Anatomy, TV show. I don't know if it's still going on, but my cultural frame of reference always seems to be 15 years too late or whatever. Early on in Grey's Anatomy, there's a couple. One guy is called Derek. Derek, it's like condensation. He's very, what is Derek? He's very handsome. You get it, condensation. There's a mean for implicit, anyways, okay. Derek and the person who's having an affair with or whatever, sorry, not an affair, they're in a relationship. They look out one day and things aren't going so well, right? They're having some relationship difficulties. They look out and they see this poor dog who's limping around. The dog's not looking so good. They go, what do you think he's going to make it? I don't know. He's not looking well, is he? He looks like he's really a bit broken down and as if he's just not going to live. In that moment, you could ask, what is Derek talking about when he's talking about the sick dog? Okay, that's the kind of replacement or substitution. Presumably, what he's actually talking about is the nature of the relationship rather than, anyways, you get it. So that's where we're going to end today. A good understanding, hopefully, of what condensation might mean, and also a hopefully viable way of thinking what symbolism or substitutions. And the idea here would be that your unconscious is constantly superimposing things. It's constantly compressing, overlapping, juxtaposing, and it's also constantly finding substitutions, replacements for certain things that could be shown but that aren't, whereby you need replacements, substitutions. So sometimes the dream about the old warship is not just about the old warship. It's presumably about something else.